update. And then later this weekend, we have some more opportunities, some more informal chatting, which we can also do after today's meeting. We'll be at Summer Sounds tomorrow. Then we'll be at the Creative Makers Mark on Saturday. So hope to see you guys there. But before we start, I wanted to introduce some special helpers that we have helping us answer some questions we have regarding the land use code. And that is Miss G's class from the Silverton School. So maybe you guys could all come up here and just say hi, just so that we all get a chance to see you and to see who's helping us with our land use code. Awesome. Thank you guys. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your help. I got to talk to these guys a little bit last week about the land use code, and we are going to go on a fun trip tomorrow to talk more about it. And then they are going to be doing a research project to help inform some of the decisions we make during our land use code update. So thank you guys so much for all your help. Great, you guys can take a seat and we'll get started with our presentation. And again, this is Gabby from Clarion, and she will start us off.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. As I mentioned, my name is Gabby. I work for Clarion Associates. We are a land use consulting firm out of Denver. So we do work all over the state of Colorado, as well as nationally, working with communities to update their land use and zoning codes. So we are at the point where a full draft of the land use code, the updated land use code, is available online. And so this presentation is going to walk you through that land use code, and specifically some of the updates that we have made to current regulations in that code. You can go to the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. Great, so when we started this project, we set out some goals. And so first and foremost, we wanted to update the town's regulations to align with the Compass Master Plan, which set out the vision for the future of Silverton. We want the land use code to create more predictable development outcomes, so simplifying and clarifying the standards applicable to development. We're creating a more clear and consistent structure just for the document, as well as trying to make it more user-friendly and easier to understand. Next slide. So this is our project schedule. As you can see, we started right around this time last year and have been pretty busy since. The project started with an annotated outline of proposed land use code changes, which was really just a guidance document of, where some of the main topics that we're going to address, what are some general directions for where to go. And that is available online as well on the project website if you are curious. All of the documents that we have published are available to you online. And then we spent the winter drafting and then have spent the summer doing some outreach with the community and trying to get all of your feedback about some of the proposed changes. And our plan is to have the final draft, which will be updated based on conversations we have this week, conversations we've had over the summer, as well as some upcoming work sessions with both the Planning Commission and the Board of Trustees to have the final draft at the end of October. And then we are expected to move into the adoption process where there will be public hearings where you can come voice your support or concerns before both the Planning Commission and the board in November and December. Next slide. So this is the full table of contents of the land use code. It consists of 11 articles. And so what this presentation is going to do is walk through these articles one by one and give a basic explanation of what the article is and any significant updates we have made to it. Next slide. So starting with the general provisions. Next slide, please. So what these are is this is really just sort of you can think of it as like the intro chapter to the zoning code. It clarifies what the purpose of the zoning code is and what it applies to. So which areas of town, it's just the private property. It is not applicable to the right of way. Those standards are located in the municipal code. And this is just one chapter of the municipal code. So this chapter establishes how this code relates to other state and federal laws that may address similar types of development considerations, as well as how it relates to any private agreements on properties. And it also establishes how applications that have been approved through the prior code and violations and pending applications are processed with this new code. So again, this is really just sort of the basics, the fundamentals of how this code is supposed to function. Next slide. Next is the zoning districts. Next slide, please. So zoning districts are those defined geographic areas that each have a unique set of standards for how property can be used. And then it also adds limitations on things like lot size, the placement of buildings, density, as well as the height of structures. And the draft land use code recommends a new zoning district lineup for the town, which carries forward the current P district, which is the public district. It consolidates two of the residential districts that currently exist, which are R1 and R1A. And then the other four districts are being renamed to better reflect the intent of those districts. And then there is one new zoning district proposed, which is intended to be applied to the zoning map to better support the goals of the Compass Master Plan, specifically in the future land use framework map. Next slide. So the full set of zoning districts includes neighborhood residential, mixed residential, neighborhood mixed use, downtown mixed use, gateway commercial, employment commercial, and public. And the land use code also includes a summary table that describes which of those zoning districts best implements the categories established by the future land use framework from the Compass Master Plan. So for example, the proposed mixed use downtown, gateway commercial, and employment commercial districts all serve to implement the business mixed use land use category. And as you're walking out tonight, we do have some copies of that future land use framework if you are curious, as well as the existing zoning map. Next slide, please. So each zoning district is subject to a set of dimensional standards that apply to either the lot itself or buildings that are constructed on the lot. The dimensional standards include minimum lot area, maximum lot area where applicable, minimum lot width, minimum building setbacks, and maximum building height. The draft land use code proposes decreasing the minimum lot area requirements for the current R1, R1A, and R2 districts. And then we have removed the minimum lot area for all other districts. It also includes decreased minimum front and side setbacks for lots less than 5,000 square feet to better accommodate the small or single lot development. The building height is proposed to increase by 5 feet in all districts except the R1 and R1A, which is staying at 30 as proposed. And something to note, if you get online and look at the full draft, you will see something referring to maximum floor area ratio. That is something that we discussed with the community earlier in the summer that we did not receive support for and will not be moving forward with. The next draft, and we'll talk about it in a second, will include a maximum building footprint limitation instead. Next slide, please. So the maximum building footprint is intended to address the Compass Master Plan's concern about the construction of overly excessively large single unit detached structures. So what the maximum building footprint means is that it's the total area of the ground level footprint of a building, and that includes both principal and accessory buildings, so the house and the garage. And that contributes to your total square footage of building footprint. So the picture on the top right there is an example of a current block in Silverton and the associated building footprint. So you can see that all of those properties range from 1,500 to 2,000 square feet of building footprint. And so the project team is considering setting the maximum building footprint at 3,000 square feet, moving forward within the R1 district to try and implement that goal of the Compass Master Plan. And this photo on the bottom right is an example of a structure in town that does maintain a 3,000 square foot building footprint for your reference. And so again, that is not in the current draft, but there's a handout about it and will be in the next one as well. Next slide, please. So in addition to those base zoning districts, the town maintains an overlay district in the historic district downtown. The historic district overlay has been updated to include language to become a CLG, which is a certified local government. And a certified local government are counties or municipalities that have been endorsed by the state's Historic Preservation Office, also known as History Colorado, and the National Park Service to participate in the National Preservation Program while maintaining standards consistent with that program. So it opens up some opportunities for the town to receive additional funding related to historic preservation. But your land use code has to have certain elements in it in order to qualify as a certified local government. So these standards have been updated accordingly. In addition, currently the town has an extra document outside of the land use code called the Builder's Handbook. And that includes specialized design requirements within the historic district based on the type and location of structures within the district. However, we've heard a lot about how that document is a bit outdated. Some of those standards can be kind of vague or hard for decision makers to use, and therefore inconsistently applied. And so to address this issue, the land use code draft replaces that with a reference to federally known standards, which are called the Secretary of the Interior standards. They're common in historic preservation field, and they also include some guidelines and extra resources for the administration of those standards to assist both staff and the Historic Review Committee in their decision-making. And then the town also currently maintains what is called the Architectural Review Overlay District. That has been removed, and we'll discuss that further later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So within the historic district overlay, the draft land use code includes some design standards, and that requires those compliance with those federal standards. It recommends that properties developing in the historic district have a pre-application meeting with the building official, so that if there's any sort of major issues or things to look out for, those can be established as early as possible in the development process so that they're not a surprise. There is a carried forward requirement to maintain a mix of non-residential and residential uses along Green Street in the historic district. However, we've clarified that the residential uses can be in the rear of the building. And then we've, rather than being required to be on the second floor. Other standards in this district include the requirement for the building to be built at the front property line, some facade treatment requirements, as well as some other design standards related to avoiding blank walls, so walls that don't have any windows, or any sort of variation along a street frontage, architectural elements that are generally compatible with the historic character of the district, and then some window variation and screening requirements as well. If you're interested in learning a little bit more detail about that, you can check out that section of the land use code. There's also a handout specific to historic preservation here as well. Next slide, please. Okay, and then along with the standards applied to the historic district, there are special procedures for development occurring in the historic district. So we've clarified the role of the Historic Review Committee. And then we've added a couple new processes. The first one is a formal process for historic district overlay designation. And that would be a process that first goes to the HRC, but then is ultimately decided on by the board. And then there are minor and major historic district reviews. And so minor reviews are any proposed construction or change that is not significant or doesn't have detrimental impact. And that can be decided on by staff, but anything that rises above that threshold has to be reviewed by the HRC. Next slide. Another unique topic in the historic district that has come up through our conversations is related to murals. You know, what do we do with proposed murals within the historic district? Do they need extra review? Do they not? And so we did some peer community research. And what we've established in this code is that on a non-contributing property, a minor process that staff can approve is required. There's some basic criteria the murals would have to meet, but ultimately they don't have to go to the HRC. But if it's a contributing property, that's a major process and it has to go to HRC for review and has some more stringent requirements attached to it. And the non-contributing versus contributing terms here actually come from a historic resource survey. The town has not had a historic resource survey performed yet. So fundamentally right now, all property in the historic district is considered contributing until that is done. But the good news about becoming a certified local government is that some of the funding could go to getting a survey like that done so that you could really distinguish between buildings within the district that really are historic and need to be preserved versus those that could be updated. Next slide, please. Okay, moving into Article 3, which is the use standards. The use standards of a code determine where certain land uses and businesses can be located in the town. The land use code helps identify those land uses that are most compatible with the character and physical environment of specific areas. Next slide, please. The use standards consist of 3 major components: the use table, use specific standards, and use definitions. The use table is organized by general use categories such as residential, civic, commercial, industrial, accessory, and temporary, as well as some subcategories in there. The use table in the proposed land use code includes existing uses, some uses that have been consolidated into broader types and new use types. The use specific standards are standards applied to certain uses based on things like proximity, compatibility, safety, environmental, or social characteristics. And then each use in that use table has a specific definition in Article 11. Next slide, please. So this is an image of the draft use table. And so it highlights the 4 major questions that a use table can answer for you. First, the left-hand column answers, what is it? What type of business am I interested in opening? What type of building am I interested in building? You look for that in that left-hand column. And next, the middle section answers, where can that use go and by what process? So if there is an S in the cell, that means a special use review is required. So that has to go, that cannot be decided on by staff, versus a P, which means permitted. So that is a use that staff can approve by right. And then if there is no letter in the cell, that means the use is prohibited. And then the final question is whether additional standards apply to that use. So if you see a section reference in the line of the use table, that means that there are special standards that apply to that use. And within that online draft, that is a hyperlink that if you click on it, will take you directly to those standards. Next slide, please. So to better align with the town's housing goals, the land use code includes a variety of updates to the residential uses. The draft introduces or adds some definitions for townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, cottage court dwellings, as well as live-work dwellings. Tiny homes have been added as an allowed structure within the manufactured home park and can also function as a standalone tiny home park. The draft also defines specifically the seasonal recreational vehicle occupancy. And so those are standards that currently exist in the municipal code that we're relocating into the land use code that allow for temporary occupancy of recreational vehicles between May and October. But they must be occupied by a qualified employee, and that means someone who works 30 hours a week or 4 days a week. And then we also added some clarification that temporary recreational vehicles for this purpose are allowed on vacant lots, but they are limited to 3 to 1 lot. Next slide, please. Updates to non-residential uses include the consolidation of similar use types into broader uses such as governmental and public facilities, community center, indoor and outdoor recreation and entertainment, and retail sales. So for example, rather than listing out certain types of stores like art store, furniture store, that sort of thing, it's all just gathered in that retail sales bucket. And then we've introduced some new commercial and industrial uses, things like animal services, so veterinarians, pet grooming, greenhouses and nurseries, artisan industrial, so really small scale industrial, so maybe woodworking or that sort of thing, and then also recycling facilities. Next slide, please. And then the final portion of the use standards addresses accessory and temporary uses of land. So new accessory uses that have some special standards include cottage industry. So sort of that very, very small scale industrial that you could do out of your home, as well as some commercial, electric vehicle charging stations, outdoor commercial and residential storage, propane tanks, and solar energy systems, so things like solar panels. New temporary uses have been added, so things like a farm stand, the farmers markets, food trucks, portable storage units, portable waste trailers, and then temporary events or sale uses. And then the town's existing temporary outdoor dining ordinance has also been incorporated into this section. Next slide, please. The next article is subdivision. You can go to the next slide. So though a significant portion of the town is already subdivided and platted, future subdivisions are possible. And all of the standards in this article will apply to those new subdivisions. So it includes design standards around the lots and the blocks of subdivisions, standards for streets, as well as utility easements. And then it also describes the required public improvements that must be constructed. So things like water and sewer, storm drainage, fire hydrants, and street improvements. Next slide, please. The subdivision regulations also establish the required dedication of public land to the town. The current dedication requirement is based on the value of gross land, and the land use code proposes replacing that with a more straightforward provision of 10% gross land area, or cash in lieu is still an option. Again, if this seems extra unfamiliar to even those of you who are familiar with development, that is because there has not been a lot of subdivision in Silverton since most of the town is already subdivided. But these are necessary standards to include in a land use code for the future. So other key changes include decreasing the maximum block length from 1,500 feet to 600 feet to encourage walkability. And then also clarified some permit requirements from the county and state. Next slide, please. The next article describes standards applied to environmentally sensitive lands in Silverton. Next slide, please. So currently the town has some separate overlay districts for each hazard type. And the draft land use code proposes replacing those with basic sets of standards and criteria. The hazard maps will still continue to be available, but will not be formal overlay districts. That's just kind of a technical detail of the zoning code drafting. But there are, in the current draft, there are 5 types of hazards and associated standards, and those are avalanche, flood, geologic, slope, and wildfire. And geologic and wildfire are new. Next slide, please. So for the avalanche hazard areas, there is an updated approach and some updated standards based on peer communities that also experience avalanches, as well as some best practices. We are carrying forward the current maps based on the February 1998 study, if you are familiar with this section. So the avalanche hazard area separated into 2 zones. There is the moderate hazard blue zone and then the high hazard red zone. And so there are different standards based on which zone you fall in. That high hazard red zone means that no new permanent residential or non-residential occupied structures may be built at all in that area. And then the moderate hazard blue zone is more flexible with what can be built and what type of process you have to follow. So there are minor and major development permits. And depending on what you are developing or what you are building will determine what type of permit process you go through. And those minor ones would be a staff approved permit. Next slide, please. Next is the flood hazard area. So these regulations have been reorganized generally, but they really continue to align with the best practice established by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA. So there are 2 different areas. There's the floodway and the flood fringe, and there are different standards applied based on how close the development is to those areas or if it is within those areas. And then a separate permit is required for flood hazard development, and that is an administrative decision. Next slide, please. Next is slope hazard areas. So the current regulations that the town has for slope hazards are pretty minimal and not the most clear. So they've been expanded and improved in this draft. It clarifies that it applies to any development or subdivision on lots with an average slope of 25% or greater. And then again, there's sort of a scaled approach to what can and cannot be built based on slopes 25 to 30%, and then anything over 30% cannot be developed on. And again, a separate permit is required for these areas that is subject to administrative review. Next slide, please. And then finally, the 2 new proposed are geologic and wildfire. So geologic hazards include things like landslide areas, rockfall areas, and unstable slopes. And then wildfire hazards are required for anything that is defined as high intensity wildfire risk based on the map that is put together by the Colorado State Forest Service. And if you are in those areas, you can have a mitigation study submitted to the Colorado State Forest Service in order to build there. Next slide, please. Next is Article 6, which is the site and development standards. So these set the minimum requirements for each part of the physical environment. So the land, the utilities, the buildings that form a development. They affect the quality of development from design of the site to building design and other specific site features. Next slide, please. So the first topic in this is mobility, connectivity, and parking. The draft land use code sets a minimum sidewalk and pedestrian walkway requirements. There are some basic design standards, if vehicle, off-street parking, so things like a parking lot are provided. There are no minimum parking requirements suggested. However, there are some minimum bicycle parking, so places to store your bikes suggested for multi-unit dwellings, which are dwellings with 5 or more units in them. And that also includes some basic design standards, depending on whether it's short term, so things like a bike rack, or if it's long term, so things like bicycle storage in an apartment building. Next slide, please. Next is landscaping and screening. The only landscaping requirements in there are state required to be in the land use code, which was recent legislation that requires that beginning in 2026, non-residential principal uses cannot install non-functional or artificial turf or invasive plant species. And then for screening, we have clarified that the maximum fence height is 6 feet for new fences. And then we have some basic roof-mounted mechanical and utility equipment screening requirements. Next slide, please. So next are the site and building design standards. And the current approach in the draft is a tiered approach that sets 3 forms of design standards. There are town-wide standards. There are those historic district standards that we already talked about. And then we are proposing standards for a long green street to replace what is currently the architectural review overlay. Next slide, please. So in the draft, you will see that the town-wide design standards begin with a design intent statement. And what that is it's intended to set the guidance that though there are more stringent standards applied in the historic district, outside of the historic district, the entire town is a landmark. So that should be taken into consideration when building and developing in Silverton. So in addition to that design intent statement, which again is really just guidance, it's not a standard. There are standards related to building for the climatic conditions of Silverton, the prohibition of reflective materials, some requirements for snow storage and shedding on properties, requirements for refuse containers, as well as the requirement for mechanical equipment to be underground utility equipment, and then some basic requirements to provide accessory storage in residential settings. And again, if you want some more detail about what some of those bullet point means, there is a handout about this as well. Next slide. Another topic you will see within the town-wide design standards is a new limit on how big a building can be built on small lots. So lots less than 5,000 square feet. So what this does is it creates an invisible box, an invisible envelope that a building can be built in. And it is intended to prevent the infilling of structures from being inconsistent or negatively impacting the neighboring properties with an overly bulky or out of scale building. Next slide, please. So the next set of standards are applicable along Green Street. So all of those adjacent to Green Street, but outside of the historic district. The historic district already has its own standards, and we don't want to overlap and confuse the two. So some of these standards relate to building orientation. So making sure the entrance of the building faces the street. There's some parameters around building mass and form, as well as materials complementing the historic character. There is a roof pitch requirement for residential structures. Again, just sort of in the spirit of the historic character of the main entry into Silverton. And then as drafted, staff is responsible for the review of these standards, but there is an option for them to refer it to the Historic Review Committee if they are concerned about a particular design coming in on Green Street. Next slide, please. And then the final portion of the site development standards addresses outdoor lighting. And because the town is moving forward with becoming an official dark sky community, the regulations have been drafted to comply with the minimum requirements for designation by Dark Sky International, which is the organization that formally designates dark sky communities. So the draft requires things like fully shielded lights that limits the light spill onto other properties. It regulates specialized outdoor lighting, but includes some exemptions. Another key detail is that it requires compliance of all outdoor lighting, which includes existing outdoor lighting, not just anything that's coming in new with the code within 10 years. And it requires a lighting plan to be submitted with development proposals by a professional so that staff can review it for compliance. So these are pretty strict, but that is in order to get that dark sky friendly, or not friendly, but the dark sky community designation. Slide, please. Next article is signage. So this involves any regulation related to signs throughout the town. If you go to the next slide, please. So we've updated these to address some federal requirements related to what is known as content neutrality. And really what that means is you cannot regulate a sign based on what it says, based on the content of it. You can regulate it based on where it can go, how big it can be, how it is placed, but you cannot regulate the content. And then we've clarified some measurements to make things easier for both applicants and staff related to building frontage, sign area. So that's how big a sign is, as well as the height of freestanding signs. And freestanding signs are things like a monument sign or a pole sign, just things that aren't attached to a building. And then we have also consolidated all of the temporary sign regulations. So things like the A-frame signs that sit in the middle of the street and along Green Street as well. Next slide, please. A key update, and this is again kind of a technical nerdy detail, but we've simplified how how much signage is allowed per property, and we've clarified that. Right now it's not as clear, and so we've also collected everything into this handy table that tells you how many freestanding, how many wall, how many projecting signs you can have per site, how big they can be, and how tall they can be. Next slide, please. Next is the administration and procedures chapter. So this guides how applications are accepted, reviewed, and acted upon. Next slide, please. So there are four main parts of this article. There's the review and decision-making bodies, development review procedures, and then specific procedures, which are divided into those decided on by staff, so administrative or the Historic Review Committee, and then those that require a public hearing before Planning Commission or the Board of Trustees. Next slide. So this review and decision-making bodies really just clears or clarifies the purpose, the duties, the membership and procedural details of Planning Commission, the Board of Adjustment, and the Historic Review Committee. Next slide, please. And then sort of the main piece, the most helpful piece of this chapter is the summary of development review procedures table. So all this table includes all of the different application types, whether or not you need certain requirements like a pre-application meeting with staff or a neighborhood informational meeting, the type of notice you may need, and then which decision-making body is deciding on the application, as well as if a hearing is required. Next slide, please. The article continues with what are known as the common review procedures. So these are the procedures that apply to most applications. And so that's things like public notice, that pre-application meeting, how applications are submitted, how they're decided upon, and then things like post-decision actions, so things like appeals, and when an application expires. Next slide, please. So the specific procedures establish the applicability of each procedure, and then it lists any relevant procedural detail for that specific procedure. So there's a specific procedure for variances. There's a specific procedure for rezonings. And they all have a flow chart that walks you through the process. And again, those are separated between administratively approved or historic review committee approved, versus those that require a public hearing. Next slide, please. Okay, Article 9 is nonconformities. And so there are 4 types of nonconformities: uses, structures, lots, and signs. Next slide. And the new regulations in the land use code clarify the status of non-conforming uses, lots, structures, and site features, how much they can change, their authority to continue, as well as when they are considered discontinued or abandoned. Next slide, please. And then the final 2 articles are Article 10, enforcement and penalties, and then Article 11, which is definitions and measurements. Next slide. So the enforcement and penalties article is a new article, and what that does is it describes how the town enforces these code regulations, what's considered a violation, and then what the remedy available to the property owner is. This also includes some current standards related to building and property appearance and maintenance, which currently prohibits buildings being boarded up in only the C2 district. Thank you. But we've expanded that to apply to all districts, but we've added some flexibility, understanding that there are ways that windows can be protected during the winter, still by being boarded up. Next slide, please. And then finally, the definitions and measurements. It's just like a little mini dictionary. It's all of the defined terms in the code, and then also how to calculate things, how certain things are measured. So how a setback is measured, how height is measured. So it really just helps staff and anyone using the code interpret it better. So we've clarified some of those measurements. All of the use terms are defined, and then we have tried to align any term that may also appear in other town documents like public work documents or housing documents to make sure they align across all of those. Next slide, please. So the next steps are our work sessions with the Planning Commission and the Board of Trustees. And then the final adoption draft will be published at the end of October. And then we will move into those hearings in November and December. Next slide, please. And then for anyone who wants to learn more, I know this was a ton of information, but there's a lot of really great resources on our project website. There is also a link to a survey that covers some of our sort of key questions that we're down to that we really, really would like some more community input on, that will inform how we draft the code and those regulations. So that link is available on there as well. All of these handouts, we've got some videos of prior learning sessions, which walk through kind of the basics of zoning, the basics of historic preservation, hazard protections. There's a few on there that are really helpful. And then we encourage you to take a look at that full draft or just the portion of it that you're most interested in. And if you have any comments or questions, you can feel free to email Lucy, and we will get your questions answered, and we would love any feedback you may have. And then the next slide's the final one. So that is it. Thanks for hanging in there with me.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any questions, comments?
Was the 98 avalanche study reviewed, see if it needed any updates?
We did not know. And what we've found looking at other communities is that, you know, there's not a lot of current active avalanche survey happening. However, in those standards, the property owner has the ability to do their own avalanche survey to either show that they're not in the red zone or not in the blue zone. There is the ability to do that, and then that would be updated on the avalanche map.
I'm curious on the regulation of maximum structure, a lot.
Mhm.
What all kind of structures is that?
The building footprint? That one?
What kind of buildings, like, does that include sheds and things like that?
Yes, so as drafted, the definition of building footprint would include any, you know, structure on the lot. However, we can also draft it to exclude small structures, you know, less than 120 square feet, or, you know, it can be drafted a variety of ways. But what we want to avoid is saying that any accessory structure wouldn't count, because then you could have someone who just maxes out an accessory like garage or something, which is not the intent of what we're trying to do, is avoid the big, massive buildings and structures.
So on that note, it's the ground floor area, it doesn't include basement or.
Correct. Yeah. And again, it's kind of confusing because right now in the draft you'll see online, there is a concept called floor area ratio, which would include all of that, but we are moving away from that based on feedback. So
And moving into what?
the maximum building footprint. So just the ground level of the structures.
What is that?
3,000.
3,000 is the maximum square foot that you could put in the what zone?
R1, and it's
And but in
R1. Yep.
That seems to me like that wouldn't limit the connection. With the 6,000 square foot, you know, below 30-foot structure, that seems like that's a huge structure. And our house, for example, is 26 with the garage and the basement is 2,600 square feet, and that's big. And on the hillside, especially on Triangle Hill, it seems like you build a 6,000 square foot structure out in the middle of the open there, and it's gonna be huge. And I think that maybe, you know, I know there's some concerns about like having multiple living, you know, duplexes and things like that, but maybe we could go with a smaller square footage and then have like the exception be, you know, come to the planning commissioner, whoever, and pitch your idea for a duplex or something like that.
Yeah, it's been tough because this is like the fourth or fifth time that we've come before this consultant.
Yeah.
About this, and it started with max square footage, and I mean, this is like the fifth time that they tried to address the McMansion problem. And I think that this is a pretty good compromise, because where it was, the last draft I saw was so restrictive, it was 2,500 total. Okay, so now we're back to a footprint. And I mean, nobody's going to be happy with it, period, ever. Like, so where do you land? And I like where you're landing today, because people, so if you're in R1 and you now are allowed 3 units in R1, because you can have a duplex plus an ADU.
You couldn't have an ADU if you have a duplex.
Say again,
You can only,
one or the other, you
Yeah.
can have a total of 2 units.
you can have a total of 2 units.
Maybe.
Either, yeah, you can either have single, because a ADU has to be on, it can't be on a duplex property. It has to be on a single
Okay,
unit.
thank you for that.
Yes, yeah. So just 2. Yeah, but
Maximum 2.
yes.
But so now we're talking a maximum of 2,
Mhm.
and there's a 3,000 square foot footprint.
Mhm.
And that seems reasonable, because if you have 2 units, you want them to each, I mean, that's 1,500 per unit. Yeah,
I think you're what Mike's saying around, it's sort of like discussing on the margins is, what do you think is too big of a house? And what do you think is too big of a house? What do you think is too big of a house? And people are gonna answer that question differently. I like where you were going, Mike, with like options for incentivizing duplex usage with bigger structures versus, you know, is a 6,000 square foot house, does the community think a 6,000 square foot house is a single family home is too big for our community? And it's kind of up to us to decide. When you think big mansion, how big of a house is that to you? And that's kind of where we're fidgeting with the margin.
Well, property in the community is 6,000.
I don't think we have
Example.
We can have fourplex, I'm sure that's probably not even 6,000, but getting close.
at the end of the
Like that.
Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, probably.
But single family home,
it's 1,000 square. So it's 4,000, so.
But the 3,000 footprint is not limited, it's for R1, right?
Correct.
So that would be a duplex.
But I think that you can have your, you know, if there's, you know, not to take away from duplexes and multi living spaces on 3,000 square foot footprint. But that should be the exception.
All I'm saying is that this is like the fifth.
Yeah,
I mean, it's, we're getting at the end of the road here, and they tried like this is the fifth time. And
It's
it's
like 6, 7, 8 times.
Right. That's right, and I like where you are, someone's saying.
I may have missed it, but we've talked a lot about maximum square footage on the lot. Is there a minimum?
Of,
What's the smallest thing you're allowed to build?
so that would be for the building code, which I believe is somewhere, I mean, you could have a tiny home.
But that would be classified as a tiny home.
Right.
But if you were to classify it as a house, I believe it's somewhere around 500.
yeah.
I agree, I think it's 500.
Yeah.
Principal structure can be 500, then you can have an accessory dwelling unit, at a minimum of 300 square feet.
Currently,
Correct.
Tiny homes are allowed in R1.
Well, so it's. Let me see if I can find the definition here. It's confusing too, because the state has recently set a definition of tiny homes that includes those that are still on like a hitch or on wheels can now be considered tiny homes. Before they were classified as recreational vehicles, but the state has changed that. So typically that's what we recommend for communities updating their land use code at this point. So the definition of single unit detached, I think you could do like a very small house, but the actual tiny home could not be built, like one on wheels. I think we just need to look at that and clarify. I don't have a straightforward answer for you at this exact second.
But can we know what the smallest house you could build? That is our foundation. That would,
well, the way it's written,
It does include.
I saw is 750 is your minimum, and then you can build another dwelling next to that at 500, that was my understanding. Minimum for
Is
the
that current?
initial home on the property must be 750, this is what I was told. That's not good, you can put a 750 would be the major house, and then you can put a 500 next to it, but that's the minimum. Maybe it's changed.
you go,
I don't know, this is, that's, I don't know, whatever she said.
The current code is, the primary dwelling can be 500 square feet, you can have an accessory dwelling, unit of 300 square feet. And I believe that carries over.
okay.
Can you have a tiny house as an ADU in R1?
Under the current code,
In the future.
in the future, a tiny house or a tiny home?
That's what's confusing. So I know it's.
A tiny home.
Yeah. So a tiny home is
On a foundation or not?
No, it doesn't, no, it doesn't have to be. So it's permanently constructed on a vehicle chassis. It's designed for long-term residency. It includes electric, mechanical, or plumbing services that are assembled at a location other than on the site. It's not self-propelled, it's not drivable. And then has a square footage of not more than 400. And then it has to meet a specific building code to tiny homes set by the state or the residential building code, which. Yeah, so I think the question that I have is, do you think there needs to be a minimum size of housing?
I think there's as much difficulty with minimum sizes as there, because of storage capacity, junkyards, because nobody's got room to put their stuff anywhere. So I think there is a problem. We worry about the maximum amount, but I think we need to worry about the minimum too. Is there a difference between, do you have a definition for a manufactured home as opposed to a mobile?
Yes.
Is there a primary one sentence difference
Yes.
that we can all understand?
Yes. So. A manufactured home meets the HUD code as of 1976.
It's on foundation, permanent foundation.
As long as it met I'm not sure, but it's that 1976 date of like when things were built and certified. So anything prior to that would be a mobile home. Great question. Wish I share screen. Hold on a second. Okay, so it's the highest point on a structure, but it excludes chimneys or steeples from the average ground level of the bottom grade. And we have a diagram on there that we can give you all as well. And there's also a measurement for average ground level on there too. But that is in the definitions and measurements article, if you all want to look at that rather than hear me try and describe it. Yes.
The definition of mixed use in that residential mixed use area?
For the district or?
Well, I was specifically looking at the map, the color coded map.
Yeah, yep.
And I saw some changes on it
Mm-hmm.
where used to be, I can't remember what it's called, but
Yep.
it allowed for, I think, small cottage industry maybe or something like that. And now it looked on the new map like it was just residential mixed use. So I was curious what that change was.
Huh. Typically, we would, when we're doing zoning conversions, we do kind of the we're adding more that can be done to the district. We're not taking things away from it. There's only a few instances where that has happened in what we've proposed, but typically it just means that we're adding non-residential uses into what would usually be more residential. But the use table establishes, sort of the mix of uses. I mean, fundamentally, a lot of districts are mixed use, meaning they include both residential and non-residential. It's just the extent of non-residential that's allowed. So like in the downtown district, there's going to be more types of uses allowed as a mixed use downtown than there would be in what we're proposing as a new district that's not yet applied to the zoning map, which is like a neighborhood mixed use. So it's like smaller scale commercial or not as many commercial uses. So still trying to make that transition from residential to downtown kind of. That makes sense.
And I think too, there's differences on what was in the Compass Master Plan map
Yes,
as opposed to what will end up in the final land code.
yes. Yes, and that will be part of our conversations that we have with Planning Commission and the Board of Trustees in the next few months, is that map. Yes. Sorry, I didn't hear you. Is Town hall or the courthouse bigger?
I think.
The courthouse. Yeah. Great question.
A question about kind of procedure, Wes said earlier, oh, it's a question about sheds and that, and you said, well, that could be, or we could do that.
Mhm.
And then, we're talking about possibly changing the square footage and we're talking about. How does that happen? Like, is that based on comments made right now and you're making notes and then you're gonna go back and change it, or you just kind of making notes and then? What's the process there for those changes?
Yeah, so we've taken, we take notes at all of these meetings. We attend public outreach. We talk with staff, kind of gather that all together. There is an online survey too that does have kind of an open-ended question at the end of it after those targeted ones, if that's how you want to submit it. And we pull all that together and we have a conversation with staff about those issues, and let staff sort of as the, main keepers of the code give us some guidance. And then we'll also bring, sort of the higher policy level discussions to the Planning Commission, to the board, for them to ultimately sort of talk about. And then that will inform what goes into the final draft. But I will say that, even once the code is adopted, it's not set in, stone forever as it is. It is meant to be looked at and reviewed. So if after a year, there are some regulations that aren't working well or aren't being used as we thought they would be, those can go forward as an amendment to the land use code. And that happens a lot with communities. It's just little tweaks that have to be made once some of these new regulations are implemented.
Where does the variance fit in?
So that would be, that's a procedure within the procedural section. And so, I think we've made some updates to the review criteria for variances and, but that's where you would find that and read about it. And if there's any, input you have specific to what's written there, we welcome that feedback.
Is a variance just an adjustment to any of these potential zoning conflict or problem?
No, variances have, they're defined around hardship, which we've defined. And there are smaller adjustments that can be made, that are not a variance, but those are really minor, little things, but, yeah, I would say take a look at that because it does set out what can be varied. And how you have to prove that you need a variance.
I'm just thinking about developments that are being put in specifically down in the mountain, and you made a good point about Silverton being basically subdivided already, but in terms of new areas that might have bigger development, has the community or the staff been discussing requirements for landscaping and replanting vegetation, or there was one point in there about native species. But I'm just curious because these are areas that are sort of becoming more, populated. And I mean, I can give my feedback on the survey, but I just wonder if that's been discussed.
Yeah, and there is a basic preservation of vegetation requirement in here. It's pretty broad and it's not overly strict, but it's the Planning Commission or the Board of Trustees has the ability to direct an applicant to, it's usually for tree preservation. And then, but the very first draft of this, we had some more specific landscaping requirements, and we got some significant pushback on that. I don't know if staff has, thought about changing that for newer things or not, but for now, we went the simpler direction of not adding those requirements. Again, that might be something that moving in the future needs to be added, maybe not.
And we had a stakeholder group come together, that kind of helped review some of these, and that was when we had those landscaping requirements. It was so new to Silverton that they were like, whoa, I don't know if we want to go down this route right now. And so that's kind of where that ended.
How much bigger will Silverton get?
Oh, wow. That's like the hardest question I've ever been asked.
Pull up that map, because there was a yellow area that showed up.
Oh, yes. So that, the future land use framework, it's at the very, towards the beginning, I think is.
I can't quite see the visuals, so let me know.
Yeah, sorry. There you go.
There you go. Oh,
So the yellow,
Yes.
explain that.
so what I just want to say about this map is it was intended to give the community a chance to visualize what they might want to see in certain areas, but doesn't necessarily conform to practicality of rezoning certain areas as well. So I just want to put that,
Or what's in our town boundaries.
or what's actually in our town boundaries. So I just kind of want to preface that of like, we are using this as a loose guide for our zoning, but there are areas like, I think, especially up here, where it's actually in the county up here. So, yeah, exactly. So we use this very loosely. Yeah.
Like, because his question was how they put it again, how they show it,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
Do you buy people or buy land? Like, buy land.
Yeah,
That's how much.
Population.
well, this would be your sort of best guide for it that you've established. So I would say that this is about probably your max here. Yeah.
And right now, we're 1 square mile.
A little less. Oh, well, with
With
Anvil,
Anvil now with more than a square mile.
take a little bit.
Yeah.
You also have at least 3 times the population. So.
Yeah, so I guess we could have 3,000 people here.
And how many people could fit in this town is a question we've been asking a lot. And so we have been working on what's called build out analysis, which kind of takes as many kind of informational and data points such as how many lots do we have in town, how many people do we have in town right now, and what does our water and utility capacity look like, and putting all those factors together to try and come up with an estimate of what those numbers would look like. So that will hopefully happen after our code is adopted, is coming up with some numbers like that.
But we can't guess at this point if 3,000 is that, or no, we can't guess.
We can guess, but I think
Is it near 3,000 or?
Well, I think where we get hung up is all of the other factors. And so when we don't have clarity on the other factors, we're like, well,
Right.
that would depend on, if
The septic, I mean, the sewer,
we got more water here, or, so we're trying, or, what's our sewer capacity and stuff like that. So I think we get really into the weeds when we start diving into those numbers to even be able to like throw out a guess.
we would need to analyze those factors before we could say.
I have a certain comment.
Yeah.
What would be good? 15. 15 feels like a good class.
Not so we can go to sporting events.
Yeah, totally, true that. That might be more than 15 in class.
Go to basketball games.
There you go, that's your metric.
15 kids per class.
Love it. It's,
Forgive me if this has been brought up before, but is it ever common to codify like open space minimums or park requirements, like one swing per 15 kids? Something like that.
no, not in a land use code. Typically, a lot of communities will have like parks plans that set out more of the like what types of elements, how many should be there. The only place that dedication, like land dedication is in the land use code is in the subdivision regulation. So if you were doing kind of a bigger subdivision, it's 10% of the land, but you could also pay what's called a fee in lieu, cash in lieu, that the town could then use to build a park elsewhere or so no, the land use code can't do a lot for that unless you're also, especially for public land dedication, because there has to be, you can't require a property owner to dedicate unless it's proportional of like how much they're paying or how much they're giving to the town. Which again, at this point would happen in subdivision, but not any other type of development.
To go back to Paul's question, just due process, so I can completely understand that. So just like the master plan, we're taking like community census, community feedback on the draft. And then it goes to draft, and so when you say staff is keeper of the code, that's to draft. And then who has the final say so? Is it the board of trustees that like adopts it and
Yes.
then it still goes through that whole
Yes,
like hearing?
Yes.
Community comment?
yes. Yes, it will go through the formal public hearing process as well. We're just trying to get it in the best form possible. So that hopefully those, you know, there's not that many sort of big changes to make or big concerns or opposition, that sort of thing. That's the goal of getting it into getting as much public input as possible throughout, you know, this past year on the draft. So that what goes to them really just needs, you know, maybe some minor refinements. But yes, it will go through public hearings too.
Is the short-term rental policy gonna have to change because there's additional areas, zoning districts being added, or?
You're just,
Are there any zoning districts that are going to now, because now there's 3 that allow vacation rentals. Will that change?
no, those are still proposed to allow them. There is still the cap has not changed either. But we were just talking about this today, actually, of that's something that we kind of need to think about a little bit more as we are thinking about the rezoning maps, that we're not quite there yet. But in the current draft, nothing has changed about where they're allowed. Sorry, that forward.
Districts will allow them, I mean, they're used by right of the EP.
Right, there, and then the other are special.
There'll be 3 other districts that allow them, and they're capped at 8 per. Which I have an issue with only because if we get so many more dwelling units, it should have been a percentage of dwelling units rather than like a finite number. Right, because 8 seems really small, if now you have 200 dwelling unit, whatever it is. I'm just saying, it seems like it should have been a percentage rather than a flat number.
Yeah.
I think there's always options to review that.
Right.
To see
Amendments
what the
like this.
market
Yep.
does. I mean,
Yep.
this original cap was put in place because of ways that the previous board wanted to respond to market forces, and so that can happen in the future.
Right, yep, and that could be done through an amendment. Yep.
Once we get to final draft version,
Yes.
what's the likelihood that the timeline for it becoming the law of the land stays consistent with what's projected, and what are the risk factors that delay that process?
Well, we are really trying to keep it in our timeline of getting it adopted by this year. We do this a lot in a lot of different communities, and there are risk factors of, that's why we're trying to find these big issues and get as much input as possible so that, we can put the best draft forward so that that type of issue doesn't just, kind of harpoon the public hearing process. So I think that, the best way to avoid that is to just, spread the word for anyone else in town who you think would be interested, get your input in, talk to Lucy, talk to Gloria. But we are trying to get it done by the end of the year, just so that, the town does have this new and improved code that can go into action.
And
Yes, that too.
is that what we want to spend our money on or something else?
Yeah.
And I will say, we started this process in April of last year by completing a development readiness plan that guided this code rewrite. I guess we could say we started with the master plan, really. And so we're trying to put together the amount of hours that we've done on this, and we were like floored with how many hours. If you haven't acted yet, now is the time, is really it. Like, if you haven't looked at it yet, now's the time. We're gonna come out with kind of a audio version that you can listen to the highlights of. So audio, visual, like however you guys need to get this information, we really want that participation. And these type of big code, it's just like, it's probably better than the budget, honestly. It's one of our biggest code, one of our biggest policy documents, but we need everyone's feedback. Like, when we say staff is the arbiter of the code, is we are the arbiter of trying to make sure that this fits with our community and what fits with our master plan. And without feedback, we can't make that decision. So that's my call to action here.
This really is the best time, to submit your comments, and just emailing me is so helpful. So then I take your comments and then we talk about them at meetings. And as we get our next drafts, I'll be able to take people's comments and think about that as I'm reviewing it. So fill out the survey, send me emails, come in to town hall and ask questions.
Is there any definitions based around unoccupied or abandoned structures or housing?
There is some in the non-conformity section, but that's specific to non-conforming. So I would need to check if there's any.
Brought that up because this is something I think that maybe staff is aware of or not, but the state is considering, and some towns are weighing in on this. Putting a vacancy tax in place. And so a lot of towns, I just read about this, I was in Vail and it was in the local paper. And so the state is considering, because right now you have to be home rule to do that, blah, blah, blah. We can't do that today, but the state is considering making a statute that would allow us to tax vacant homes. And I would encourage our town to show support for that to the state. And say, yes, we are allowed to tax vacant homes.
Well, it would only be for the voters, it should be,
At state level, it's going to go to the voters, right? Say again?
there's definitions around what.
And I don't know, for me, that says, well, like, are you using utilities or not, but I don't know what the definition of that is.
In a town like Silverton, where we're like 42% unoccupied or something, I think it's pretty relevant.
And I agree, I think that our town should get in touch with our senators and say we're in support of this.
Some places do it the opposite, where you actually get a benefit if you are a full-time primary.
It's the reverse, it's not a penalty, it's what's being proposed at the state level is.
Yes. And all of that is outside of the land use code.
It is, but I'm glad you brought it up,
Yeah.
because, I think that our town should show support on the state level for that.
Yeah, we could at least like put some definitions in the land use code that would show support in some way.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean,
I think we're gonna have to learn a lot more about it before we can say support or not.
sure,
You know, I mean, so we need, I don't have the slightest idea about what all.
so now you know, you should look into this.
Yeah, speaking of it.
Again, we try and use it, if the state did do that, that would simply give us the option.
That's correct, where today you do not have that option.
Right, no, it gives us the option to put a ballot initiative.
We could vote to decide.
That's
Right
correct.
now, we can't.
Right.
Giving us more options even. Okay.
Do you have a current zoning, new zoning map with the new proposed zoning?
Not yet, we're working on it. All that's available, right now online though, there is the current zoning map. And then there's what's called the conversion map, which just takes what so we said R1 and R1A are becoming R1. So then you'll see that those are R1. We said that R2 is R2. So the new district is not applied to the map. It's just everything is what it's converting to. But then we have a map that is the opportunity area map to take a look at, which will be what is kind of guiding our first cut at the rezoning map. And that comes from trying to look at this future land use framework, which is pretty broad in its like categories, and it doesn't, we kind of have some more thinking to do about, there's going to be multiple districts in those giant chunks of blue. That can't be one district. Like it's just not, it's not functional to do that way. So if you look at that opportunity map, we sort of highlighted areas that based on what is on the ground and what is currently zoned and what the future land use framework has, there might be, those are kind of the areas that might change more than others or are going to see some shifts could be seeing some shifts in zoning.
Explain on that.
On the survey, because that's where I saw where you had the dots, you have
Yes.
like, yellow,
Yep.
red,
Yep.
blah, 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 proposed, potentially.
Yep.
Is there, did you guys, I don't mean to make it a lengthy answer from you, but we did have some discussions years ago about where to allow ADUs when we had such a shortage of housing. Have you addressed ADUs as far as where they can be?
Yes.
They're permitted across the.
Where single unit,
That's in our current.
which is allowed. Yep. Okay,
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.